Jungian psychology from Jung himself is still advancing. I'm going to talk a little bit about the evolution here, which is, here's a foreword to this book, Psychology of the Unconscious. This is the 1912 book, but it's a new foreword. It was written in 2001, and the foreword is called The Americanization of Jungian Ideas. Okay, and that's in the Dropbox in the subfolder called 11/28/16, which is today, right? So if you go into the folder that says handouts, then every week by date, and I give the date in a 6-digit number. Okay, so today is 11/28/16. Okay, so in that folder you will find this, which you can print for yourself. I'm going to read a copy of that.
What was it?
The Americanization of Jungian Ideas. Now, mind you, this is a new foreword. This is a new version. Okay, so let me explain what the significance of that is. He wrote this book, The Psychology of the Unconscious, and in 1912 it was published, and it caused his split with Freud. Okay. He then entirely revised it 40 years later, and it became Symbols of Transformation. And he advanced it a hell of a lot. But Jungian scholars still think this version is important, so this was republished in 2001 as Psychology of the Unconscious, once again with this new foreword, and the new foreword is called The Americanization of Jungian Ideas. Now, let me just read the first paragraph to you. Here we have yet another printing of Beatrice Hinckel's 1916 translation of Jung's Psychology of the Unconscious, still in circulation after 86 years, which attests to the continuing influence of Jungian ideas, especially on the American continent. Indeed, without America, there may have been no Freud and no Jung. That is to say, without their wealthy American patients, their American disciples, and the continuing widespread sale of their works to an American psychological public fascinated with depth psychology, the saga of Freud and Jung might never have been written. So that's the first paragraph of this foreword. It's pretty interesting. It goes on to talk about how Jung sort of fit in to some things that were going on in spiritualization and things in America that weren't going on in Europe during the late 19th century. But anyway, Jung himself then completely revised this book very dramatically. And as you can see, even the thickness of the two books is quite different. I mean, there's an extra 3/8 of an inch in this version, right? And what's interesting in this is that this has a new epilogue that was written by Jung, which did not appear in this version. And this version was translated by R.F.C. Hall. So this is an entirely different translation. Now, R.F.C. Hall was an invalid. Okay, he was an invalid, and he could do one thing, and that was translate from German to English.
Wow.
And so he spent like 40 years or longer translating Jung's work into English. And that was primarily his life's work.
Yeah, he must have done a good job too, because it reads so well.
Right, and so Hall wanted to retranslate it because although Beatrice Hinckel was a very smart lady, she was, among other things, she was the first woman chief medical officer of a city in the United States. She was named the chief medical officer of San Francisco in 1899. And one of the first women doctors, right? And so Beatrice met Jung very early on and was taken by, I guess she met him at the Weimar Conference in 1911. and then she was moved to do this translation into English, and the stuff all fits together, Elizabeth, because if we go back in this book now, okay, where's Beatrice? Okay, so here's the Weimar Congress of 1911. This was really the first major congress of people that were interested in psychotherapy. And in it is Freud, of course, but Emma Jung is here, but Tony Wolff is here, and also Beatrice Hinkle is here. And what's interesting is in the book, which was written by another of the Valkyries, Jung had a bevy of women around him who were interested in his work. And one of them, probably the most prominent one today in Jungian circles, is Marie-Louise von Franz. And Marie-Louise wrote a major part. She wrote the individuation part of this book. But it's very interesting that in this image, she did not identify Tony Wolff, Marta Birdinghouse, Beatrice Hinkle, and Lou Salome was a lover of Friedrich Nietzsche. And she was in a menage a trois with Nietzsche and I think Freud in the 1880s, right? And Maria Mulzer, who was also rumored to be an affair that Jung had. Maria Mulzer.
How much of this was the bohemian kind of thing going on in that culture?
I couldn't say. I mean, Jung was pretty uptight at the beginning. He certainly was uptight because they were from a very formal culture. Did you watch Downton Abbey at all? Emma Jung was brought up in that kind of an environment. Her father was the third wealthiest man he was the wealthiest man, I think, in Switzerland, and she ultimately was the third wealthiest woman or third wealthiest person in Switzerland, and she married this penniless doctor. Yeah, this penniless doctor who had followed a disreputable career of working on mental health and working with mental patients. So that's why the Emma Labyrinth, the story of Emma Jung, is really, really interesting because she was quite a piece of work in her own right.
I think you're right on though on the subject with the bohemian. A lot of that was going on. I recall around the 1880s to the 1900s. A lot of the wealthy were.
Yeah, and that's what right, and that's what Otto Gross was. Yeah, that's what Otto Gross was also, right? It was this guy in this movie. So anyway, the significance of this, which is what I was driving at, is that Jung wrote an epilogue to the book when he redid it. I didn't give you the whole epilogue, but I did make copies of the second and third of 4 pages. But the whole thing is on the Dropbox if you want it. For purposes of the video, I wanted to just read a couple things here. Psychology of the Unconscious mainly follows a schizophrenic patient, or a patient named Frank Miller, a female patient, but her name was Frank, a woman named Frank, and she had written down her visions. And Jung never met her, as far as I know, but one of his professors had her visions. And so Jung wrote this book about using her experiences and her visions as a way to get into the book. So what we're talking about here is the invasion of the unconscious into your conscious life. If you go entirely by instinct, that's all coming from the unconscious. If I throw a ball at you right now, you're going to react or grab it or something, but it will be an instinctual reaction, right? But there's a lot more down there, and so what Jung was finding out in the Bergholzli, where he was working, is that these schizophrenic patients and these psychotic patients were having all these visions of mythological subjects that they couldn't possibly know. Okay, they were seeing visions of things which are available in literature, of things that people saw 3,500 years ago. But these people that he was talking to couldn't possibly know them. They were either uneducated Swiss or whoever. And so he was finding these mythological themes in the psyche of these mental patients. And so the question is, how do you control it? And so that's what this balance between civilization and instinct is, because your instinct is unruly, truly unruly. It will get you into trouble instantly. I mean, if you do what you just want to do right now, whatever it is, might not work in this restaurant.
It might get you escorted to the door.
Yeah, that's right. And so you need civilization, that side of your psyche, to decide what's right and what's wrong. The way Jung put it was, your psyche doesn't have to live in modern society. Your psyche doesn't know anything about modern society. Okay, your psyche developed over millions of years, and it knows nothing about the way we live now. And so you have to use your own experiences applied to your psychic response. So yes, visions and dreams do tell you something. They're telling you something. I mean, my example is a police car. Every time I have a vision of a police car, and it's always the same, but it pops into my mind, and as soon as I have that vision, I know that there's a speed trap up ahead. Okay, every time, it always works. Within 2 miles, there will be a speed trap. And that's my psyche telling me that there's a speed trap there. Now, how does that work? Well, I don't know. I mean, it could be the oncoming traffic changes its speed slightly or something, but it's something my instinct recognizes. And then my instinct tells me that through this vision of the police car, you're there. It's better than a radar detector, I promise you.
So it's like being in kind of a creepy area, you get a feel for the
Yeah.
area. It's like something isn't right here.
Mm-hmm.
That's a vision in essence.
Well, it could be that.
Or an instinct.
Yeah.
I mean, I was in part of West Virginia one time. It was sincerely creepy, and I mean,
Southwest.
it was a beautiful environment,
Right.
but it was just dark.
Right.
Oh yeah, my son and I were talking about that.
Psychologically dark.
Right.
Camping in Watauga, which is actually on the southeast side, but it was so dark. The amount of stars we saw was amazing.
Mm-hmm.
It was remarkable when we were in Key West.
Mm-hmm.
As we were driving back, you could see, and he said that was less. He remembered,
Mm-hmm.
but a totally different experience than what we're used to.
Right. Right. And so your psyche will tell you things it thinks you need to know. Now, how does it tell you that? It takes images from your life, which it's experienced in your lifetime, and it expresses all of your thoughts, actually, are images. Believe it or not, that's what Dr. Jung is saying. Every thought you ever had is an image. Even a word is an image. Okay, because it's a symbol of something with meaning. So your psyche has, your unconscious has within it all these meanings, and when you're conscious, in your conscious mind, normally they don't break through. And so what I'm going to be reading here is about an invasion of the unconscious, right? But when you have a vision, that's your unconscious telling you something. When you have a dream, that's your unconscious telling you something. It may tell you something you don't want to hear, right? It may be a warning, whatever. But you have to then apply your conscious mind to that and decide whether that's your instinct telling you something. You have to pay attention to your instinct, because that's how you're here today. Because your ancestors, going back millions of years, paid enough attention to their instincts to stay alive, right? They paid enough attention to their instincts to stay alive, and so your instincts are essential, but they didn't have to live in the 21st century, and whatever you got was finalized on the day of your birth. There's nothing new in there since then. And so your instincts probably don't know anything about television. Okay, there was no television when I was born. And so everything that comes through television and such, yes, I have the images in it in my conscious mind and my memory, but they're not in my instinct. Okay, but my instinct takes those images and sends me a metaphorical story. Okay, it tells me a story. That's what a dream is. It's telling you a story that will get the message through to you, because it doesn't speak in English. Your instinct doesn't speak in English. It speaks in images. Okay, sorry, what was your question?
Doesn't instinct develop though in this lifetime too?
Well, yes, you can develop your instinct, but the fundamentals of it are there. I mean, you may teach yourself to, let's say, shoot an arrow and hit the bullseye every time. Okay, you could do that. But that would be based on spending 10,000 hours on the archery range.
Also mastering, so you're
It's
essentially saying the repetition of mastering
it's a kind of
creates
mastering,
the
surely.
instinct.
Right. And so if you master it, if you master arrow shooting, guys up in Mongolia, they can hit a running rabbit from a horse at a gallop with a bow and arrow, but they weren't born with that.
Is it biological versus?
Pardon?
So what I hear you saying is that instinct is developed through a particular repetition of that particular.
I would think
reading
so.
People, like reading people.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out people
Whether you like them or not, surely.
is more of exposure.
Exactly.
Of not that particular person, but
It's
of all human beings, and really focusing on them, and then you feel that eventually can be developed.
Yeah, it's like the Myers-Briggs. I can now meet somebody and pretty much figure out what their personality type is. But the first 2 weeks that my lady friend was trying to explain it to me over lunch, I had to have her repeat it over and over and over again. I mean, she must have thought I was dumb, but she just sat there and just repeated it very patiently, and eventually I grokked it. Okay, so we're talking about invasion of the unconscious, and we're talking about the Miller fantasies. So this is the epilogue to Symbols of Transformation. So he wrote this 40 years after writing the original book. So he says, so end the Miller fantasies. Their melancholy outcome is due largely to the fact that they break off at the critical moment when the threat of invasion by the unconscious is plainly apparent. It is hardly to be supposed that Miss Miller, who evidently had not the faintest clue as to the real meaning of her visions, which even Theodore Flournoy, despite his fine feeling for values, could do nothing to explain, would be able to meet the next phase of the process, namely the assimilation of the hero to her conscious personality with the right attitude. In order to do so, she would have had to recognize the fate demanded of her, and what was the meaning of the bizarre images that had broken in upon her consciousness. So Symbols of Transformation is about the fact that through life we are transforming. Okay, we're children, and then we become pubescent teenagers, and we behave in somewhat different ways at that time, and then we become adults from being a pubescent teenager, And then we learn to be mature adults, and then we learn how to be older adults, and finally dying adults. Okay, those are psychological transformations through life. They require you to, well, you're not required to recognize them, but anyway, they're happening, and so it would be very wise if you do understand them, the steps. So this book is about the symbols that come up in dreams and visions that tell you about those transformations. And that's what his work is about. In this next little bit, he referred to something which said to me, I wrote Meiko on it because Meiko is the name of my novel. And so it's what happened to me, probably what happened to him when he had his experience, which is, to the objective observer, it is perfectly clear that the fantasies were products of a psychic energy not under the control of the conscious mind. That's definitely true in my case. It was not under my conscious mind's control. They were longings, impulses, and symbolic happenings which it was quite unable to cope with, either positively or negatively. The instinctual impulse that was trying to rouse the dreamer from the sleep of childhood was opposed by a personal pride that was distinctly out of place. So anyway, he goes on, but he's talking about what these images and visions mean. He talks in some of his work about that time, saying, if I couldn't remind myself every day that I'm Carl Jung, I live at 228 Seastrasse, my wife is Emma Jung, I have 4 children. If he couldn't connect himself back to that daily reality, then he could have gone the other way into the Burgle sleep as a patient, right? To a degree, it's a good thing to be getting dreams and visions, and we always get dreams at night. Pretty much everybody dreams, and that's when we take our conscious mind out of the way and actually our unconscious is sending us stuff all the time, except our conscious mind is too busy to pay attention most of the time. But when you have a vision during the day, when all of a sudden you hear me say something and that has you thinking about some other vision that was happening in your life, that's your unconscious telling you something about that. I don't know what it is, but nonetheless, that's what it is. Okay, so Miss Miller didn't have a psychologist to help her with the visions and what the transformations that they could be presaging. And Jung himself, one of the things about Jungian analysts is that it's mandatory that every Jungian analyst have an analyst, okay? Because when you're sitting with 6 or 7 patients a day and you're going into their unconscious and you're interacting, it's kind of like a dance, and you're putting your psyche at risk too. One of the aspects of this is the dark side, right? We all have a dark side, and that's what the duality is, right? And so one of the objectives of Jungian psychology is to assimilate the dark side into your conscious mind and personality, because that's what gets you to being yourself. Okay, think of it as, okay, David was there and all this side is very clear, but this side is the dark side, and it requires a different kind of tool to deal with it, right? But both sides have to be there before you have the beautiful statue, right? Or you could think of it another way, that first of all, you're dealing with the light side, which is the surface of the marble, but then you bang down a little farther where the light never shined on that marble for the last million years, and now you're banging into something that's a little harder. And if you make a mistake, then you just put a nick in the knee, Reading from this. For patients in this situation, it is a positive lifesaver when the doctor takes such products seriously and gives the patient access to the meanings they suggest. In this way, he makes it possible for the patient to assimilate at least part of the unconscious and to repair the menacing dissociation by just that amount. At the same time, the assimilation guards against the dangerous isolation which everyone feels when confronted by an incomprehensible and irrational aspect of his personality. Isolation leads to panic, and that is only too often the beginning of a psychosis. The wider the gap between conscious and unconscious, the nearer creeps the fatal splitting of the personality, which in neurotically disposed individuals leads to neurosis, and in those with a psychotic constitution, to schizophrenia and fragmentation of the personality. The aim of psychotherapy is therefore to narrow down and eventually abolish the dissociation by integrating the tendencies of the unconscious into the conscious mind. Normally, these promptings are realized unconsciously, or as we say, instinctively, and though their spiritual content remains unnoticed, it nevertheless insinuates itself into the conscious spiritual life of the patient, mostly in disguised form without his being aware of it. All this passes off smoothly and without difficulty, provided that his consciousness contains certain ideas of a symbolic nature. For those who have the symbol, the passage is easy, say the alchemists. If, on the other hand, there is already a tendency of dissociation, perhaps dating back to youth, then every advance of the unconscious only increases the gap between it and consciousness.
Whoa, what does that mean?
Well, I think he's saying that if you don't have control of what's coming out of the unconscious, then it can increase the dissociation, the gap.
Why? It should do the opposite.
Because it's stronger than you are. Your unconscious is stronger than your conscious mind. And so if you lose control of it, then it can really cause problems.
I see what you're saying. You're saying it to like dig it up too fast, or
Right.
I see what you're saying.
It can look.
Thank you.
Okay, so I was writing this novel, right? I was having these visions. I was controlling it because I was doing it only 2 hours a day, okay, from 6 to 8 in the morning. Then I was going on with the rest of my life. And so these experiences were happening. Well, suppose at the end of my writing my novel, I got this delusion that I'm a great novelist and that I should write more of this stuff, and especially the sexually explicit stuff or whatever, right? And I think, hey, man, that's cool. I'm going to keep going on that. And, you know, I can tell you that's in there. It's in all of us. And it came out in part in this novel. But, you know, when I got to the end of it, I said, whoa, wait a minute. I don't want this in American society, or I don't want it in my life right now. I finally did put it in, but only when I understood it. And so at the end of it, I put it in my drawer for 21 years. And then finally, now that I understand it was the shadow and it was my unconscious bubbling up and so on. And so I went on and founded a public company after that. So it was okay. You know? But I learned something about myself by writing that novel. And I learned some things about other experiences in my life that I had had, because that novel is the autobiography of my anima during this period when I was living in Japan. Okay, so what I have told the others here is that everything that's in that novel either happened to me or someone with whom I'm intimate or was intimate with at the time. So everything in there actually happened. Okay. Now, as I think about it, I've said that emphatically a number of times, but it actually happened in my psyche, if it didn't physically happen, but most of it physically happened. So most of it I know is quite true, and it's actually quite mild compared to what would actually happen to a girl like that who came to Tokyo to earn her dowry. Right. Ever since that time, I've been reading either about Jung or reading him directly. And so the next thing that I read after that was Goddesses in Everywoman and Gods in Every Man, okay, which are two books by a Jungian analyst named Jean Shinoda Bolin. In terms of circling the whole, that was the first part of my first layer of circling the whole. That and Women Who Run with the Wolves and Man and His Symbols was sort of my first run around the whole. Okay. And then at some point, I don't remember exactly when this was, I said, "Oh, wait a minute. I don't get this. I'm just going to go back and read Jung." And the reason I had been put off it, in fact, I probably did it at the time of the Red Book, honestly, because up until then I had been reading books about him and about his thought and about things like Goddesses in Every Woman. In some way it was a bit unsatisfying, but I was put off because I thought, okay, well, he wrote 20 books about psychotherapy. I don't want to be a psychotherapist. I don't care about therapy, but that's not what he was about at all. Okay, and that's not what his writing is about at all. But I didn't know that. Okay, so I had been put off for all those years thinking that it was about psychotherapy, and I didn't want to be an analyst. I didn't want to sit in a room with somebody and figure out what's going on in their sick mind. I have enough going on in my own sick mind, right? But then when I read the introduction to the Red Book, then I realized that here was his experience, which was like mine back when that novel burst out of my mind. Okay, and it literally just burst out in 8 months. And so when I read the Red Book, and all of a sudden I saw this great wisdom in there, and it wasn't so difficult to understand, then I started to get that maybe I ought to go back and read what the guy actually wrote. And it's just awesome. I mean, you just can't believe it when you read it. I did this review of this television program. It's called The Crown. It's hugely archetypal about the queen archetype. I pulled out a page about the queen archetype. It's very long and talks about how it comes together, but it says, nevertheless, the old needs still remain for a queen or a king or a president. One, collective effort still needs to have a symbol to remind us of its mystery and power. This in particular can forge a link between the various cultures within the one nation. Two, we still need a sense of kinship, a recognition within the community, and a meaningful role within it. Three, we still need meaningful shared activity within which we can find bonding. That millions of people watch a TV soap opera at the same time is not bonding in the same way that gathering and celebrating a harvest together was bonding to older communities. And four, individuals still need a meaningful way of linking with the spirit of their culture and history. For these are the very womb of their personality, the mother and father of their identity. And so, one question that I always have asked myself is, what is it that makes me and my fellow Marines willing to fight for our country in a certain way, even though we're all very different? Okay, there are Black Marines, there are Muslim Marines, there are Arab Marines, we're all so different. And yet we all have one common bond, and it's this bond that they're talking about. And that bond comes from symbols. It comes from the symbol of the presidency. It comes from the symbol of the American flag, okay, as a symbol. And those symbols, and this is what he was talking about in alchemy and what alchemists were talking about is these symbols have a mysterious bonding effect within our psyche. We can't necessarily explain it. I don't think there's any Marine, I'm probably the only Marine in the world that could even articulate it this far, right? But nonetheless, there's a certain je ne sais quoi that makes us American sitting at this table. There's something that makes us all American, no matter how we voted last week, a couple weeks ago, or anything else. There's something that makes us American. And, you know, even Dr. Jung benefited from it, as I read. But anyway, both of these documents are in the Dropbox. So if you want to read
In the British Empire, 19th century, the Queen was extremely powerful as a symbol. Queen Victoria
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
held the whole British Empire together.
Right. Absolutely.
That image.
Absolutely. And if you watch The Crown, it's 10 episodes. You can watch them all right away. And we did. Yeah, it's on Netflix. Yeah, I watched it in the last 10 days, all 10 of them.
In 10 days, I would have had it in 2 once I get into them.
Well, I've watched 10 of them, and then I've watched about 7 of them twice because my mother-in-law had to see them too.